The palace was always quiet at night, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The grand halls of the royal residence stretched across wide levels of shining metal and glowing crystal, built with precision that only an advanced civilization could achieve. Every corridor was watched. Every door was locked with layered security codes. Every movement inside the palace was recorded by systems that never slept. And yet, on this night, none of it felt comforting. The queen had left earlier that day. Her departure had been planned carefully, with escorts, security fleets, and strict instructions for palace defense. She was attending a high-level gathering far from the home world, where political matters between allied systems were being discussed. It was supposed to be a routine journey, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. She trusted her palace. She trusted her guards. She trusted the systems built to protect everything she cared about most. Most of all, she trusted her children would be safe in her absence. Inside the palace, life continued in its structured rhythm even after her departure. Servants moved through their assigned duties. Guards maintained their stations. Drones floated silently along their patrol paths. Everything appeared perfect on the surface, like a machine running exactly as designed. Among all those moving parts, there was one figure most people barely noticed. A human servant. He was assigned to the royal household through a long-standing agreement between species. Humans were not native to this empire, but they were known for adaptability, discipline, and a strange kind of quiet resilience. In the palace, his duties were simple. He cleaned certain private chambers, maintained environmental systems in less sensitive areas, and sometimes assisted in caring for the younger members of the royal family when requested. He was not part of the security structure. He was not trained as a soldier in their official sense. He was not given authority over any systems or access to restricted defense controls. In the eyes of the palace hierarchy, he was background presence. Useful but not important. Still, there was something about him that others occasionally noticed but never questioned for long. He paid attention to details that most ignored. He remembered patterns. He studied routines without meaning to. When he walked through corridors, he did not simply move from one task to another. He observed doors that opened too slowly, guards that rotated at predictable intervals, maintenance routes that overlapped with restricted areas. He never spoke about these things. He simply stored them away in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that did not yet matter. That night, as the palace dimmed into its resting cycle, he was finishing his usual rounds near the upper residential wing. The children of the royal family were asleep in their chambers, attended by soft automated systems designed to monitor their safety and comfort. Everything was calm. Then something changed. At first, it was so subtle that even the palace systems did not react. A small fluctuation in the security grid. A delay of milliseconds in a data response. A signal that did not match any approved pattern. On its own, it meant nothing. Even the most sensitive systems could misread minor disturbances. But then it happened again and again across different sectors of the palace network. The human servant stopped walking. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something that no one else could hear. His eyes shifted toward the nearest wall panel, where soft light indicators pulsed in steady rhythm. For a moment, everything still looked normal. But he had learned over time that normal, in a place like this, could change faster than anyone expected. He continued walking, but his pace slowed. Not because he was afraid, but because he was thinking. The corridors around him were still empty, yet something about the environment felt different. The usual background hum of the palace systems had a slight distortion, like a note in a song being played out of tune. Then came the second sign. A security drone passed overhead, moving in its usual patrol path. But instead of continuing forward, it paused mid-route for half a second before correcting itself and moving on. That pause was not supposed to happen. Machines like that did not hesitate unless something interrupted their command flow. The human servant stopped completely this time. He looked toward the ceiling, toward the direction the drone had gone. His expression did not change much, but something inside him shifted. He turned slowly toward the nearest access panel and placed his hand near it. Not touching, just observing the faint flicker of response lights. The palace was still quiet, still orderly, still appearing untouched. But now he knew something was wrong. He moved faster. Not running yet, but no longer walking casually. His route changed direction, away from his assigned duties and toward the upper residential wing. The wing where the royal children slept. As he moved, more inconsistencies appeared. A hallway light that should have been green was now flickering between green and dull amber. A door that should have opened automatically for staff recognition hesitated before unlocking. A distant sound echoed through the structure, barely noticeable, like metal shifting wear. It should not. The palace was being interfered with. And whatever was happening, it was not part of any approved protocol. He reached a junction where 3 corridors met. Normally, this area would have at least 2 guards stationed nearby. Tonight, there were none. The absence was not announced. It simply existed, like a missing piece in a familiar pattern. He paused again, longer this time. His mind worked quickly, connecting fragments of observation. System delays. Drone hesitation. Missing guards. The timing was too coordinated to be random. This was not malfunction. It was interference. Intentional interference. He exhaled slowly, then made a decision that would normally be far beyond his authority. He continued toward the children's wing. As he moved deeper into the palace, subtle signs of disruption became more frequent. Emergency lighting systems in certain sections flickered on without command. Internal communication channels produced brief bursts of static. A locked maintenance door was found already open, its security seal bypassed cleanly rather than broken. Whoever was inside the system knew what they were doing. The human servant's pace increased again. Now there was urgency in his movement, but still no panic. His steps remained controlled, deliberate. He was not running blindly. He was calculating paths, avoiding main corridors, choosing routes that reduced exposure. He reached a service passage that ran parallel to the royal chambers. From here, he could access a restricted observation point used only by high-level staff. He had never been granted permission to enter it officially, but he knew how it worked. He had seen others use it before. The access panel scanned him. There was a long pause, long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then, unexpectedly, it granted entry. The door slid open. Inside, the corridor was darker, quieter, and colder. From this angle, he could see partial readings from the internal systems of the royal wing. What he saw made the situation clearer and far more serious. Multiple security nodes were offline. Not failing. Not malfunctioning. Disabled. He stared at the data for a moment longer than necessary, as if confirming that what he was seeing was real. Then he turned away from the display. The children were in that wing, and the systems meant to protect them were no longer fully active. For the first time that night, his expression tightened slightly. Not fear, but something closer to focus sharpening into resolve. He stepped out of the observation corridor and began moving faster than before. The palace around him was no longer just quiet. It was compromised. And somewhere ahead, unseen forces had already entered the most protected part of the entire structure. The first signs of trouble inside the palace did not come with alarms or explosions. They came with silence breaking in the wrong places. In the royal wing, where everything was supposed to be perfectly controlled, the systems began to behave like they were unsure of themselves. Security lights that normally glowed in steady blue shifted for a moment into dull red before returning to normal. Doors that should have opened instantly paused, as if something was questioning their commands. Even the air circulation system, usually soft and constant, had a slight irregular pulse that made the environment feel uneasy without anyone being able to explain why. At first, no one reacted. In a place like the palace, small irregularities were common. Complex systems sometimes had minor delays, especially when handling large volumes of data across multiple levels. Guards and staff were trained not to panic over small fluctuations. So when the first internal alert flickered and disappeared within seconds, it was dismissed as a routine glitch. But the glitch did not stay alone for long. Within moments, a second alert appeared in another section of the palace network. Then a third. then several more, spreading like faint ripples across the system. Each one was isolated at first, not connected in a way that made sense. One corridor reported a minor access delay. Another reported a brief loss of sensor clarity. A storage wing showed a momentary disconnect from the central control grid. Individually, none of it was serious. Together, it formed a pattern. Still, the palace staff did not fully recognize it yet. They were used to trusting the system. It had never failed them in any meaningful way before. It was built to be stronger than any known threat. So when small inconsistencies appeared, the natural response was to assume technical instability rather than danger. That assumption would prove costly. Deep inside the structure, something far more deliberate was unfolding. The intrusion had not arrived with force. It had arrived with precision. Access points that should have required multiple authorization layers were opened in a sequence that left almost no trace of forced entry. Instead of breaking through defenses, the attackers moved around them, exploiting timing gaps between system checks. Security protocols were bypassed in ways that suggested detailed knowledge of the palace's internal architecture. It was not chaos. It was controlled movement, and the control was spreading closer to the royal chambers. In the upper residential wing, where the royal children slept, the environment remained calm on the surface. Soft lighting continued to glow at low intensity. Monitoring systems still displayed steady readings. The chambers were warm, secure, and quiet, but something was wrong just beneath that surface. A guard stationed near the entrance corridor noticed it first. A faint hesitation in the hallway door as it cycled through its security check. He placed a hand on his communication device, ready to report it, but before he could speak, the system corrected itself. The door opened normally, and all indicators returned to green. He hesitated. Then he lowered his hand. That hesitation would be the last clear warning he would ever have. Because in the same moment, somewhere deeper in the palace network, a command sequence completed its final step. The security grid of the royal wing shifted. Not shut down. Rewritten. What had been a defensive structure seconds ago was now partially reconfigured to allow selective access. And that was when the real breach began. At first, it was invisible. No alarms. No dramatic warnings. Just small, coordinated movements that bypassed external detection. Internal sensors were briefly blinded, then reactivated with altered reference data. This meant the system was now seeing what the intruders wanted it to see. Guards along the outer corridors suddenly found their communication channels filled with minor interference. Messages took longer to transmit. Responses were delayed by seconds that felt longer than they should have. In a high-security environment, even a small delay could be dangerous. And then the first guard disappeared from the network entirely. Not physically gone, just no longer visible to the system. To everyone monitoring from central control, it looked like a temporary signal loss, a routine disconnection. But in reality, the guard had been isolated from coordination, effectively removed from the shared defense structure. Inside the corridor, he still stood at his post, unaware that he was now alone in a way the system did not fully recognize. That was when movement appeared. Not loud, not rushed, controlled and deliberate. Figures moved through access points that should have been locked. They did not trigger alarms because the alarms had already been softened. The palace itself was being used against its defenders, its systems subtly guided into accepting the presence of intruders as authorized movement. One by one, entry points into the royal wing were secured from the inside. Back in the control areas, confusion began to grow. Technicians noticed inconsistencies in the logs. Data streams did not match physical sensor readings. A door marked as sealed showed internal movement activity. Another corridor showed no activity at all, even though patrols were scheduled there. The system was contradicting itself. But there was still no full alarm. Because whoever was doing this understood the most important rule of high-security environments. Do not trigger panic until it is too late to respond effectively. Meanwhile, in the royal wing itself, the sense of normal life was still holding on in small ways. Inside the children's chambers, soft ambient lights continued to simulate a calm night environment. Protective fields hummed gently in the background. The children slept without knowing that anything outside had changed. But the stability around them was beginning to thin. In one of the side corridors, a maintenance access panel opened without authorization. No sound followed. No alarm responded. The panel simply slid aside as if it had been commanded by the system itself. From that opening, movement spread further inside. At the same time, deeper in the palace, emergency systems attempted to run a background integrity check. For a brief moment, they detected the interference clearly. A warning began to form in the central network. But it never reached full activation. The signal was interrupted mid-process. Not destroyed, redirected. The palace had been designed with multiple layers of defense, but those layers relied on trust between systems. When that trust was manipulated, the defenses began to work against themselves. In the upper wing, the remaining guards started to notice physical signs of intrusion. A corridor that should have been empty showed faint motion shadows at its far end. A door that should have remained sealed opened briefly and then closed again without explanation. A security drone passed overhead but did not complete its normal scan pattern, instead drifting slightly off course. One guard finally attempted to raise a full alert. He never completed the transmission. His device went silent. No warning followed. No confirmation. Just silence where communication should have been. That was when the remaining defenders began to understand something was very wrong. But understanding came too late, because the intruders were already inside the structure of the wing, moving closer to the heart of what they were targeting. The royal children's chambers. And at that exact moment, far below in the service corridors, the human servant was still moving upward through the palace, unaware of every detail but certain of one thing. The pattern he had seen was no longer just a possibility. It was already happening. He did not wait for confirmation anymore. The moment the human servant understood the scale of what was happening inside the palace, his movement changed completely. What had once been careful observation turned into urgent precision. Every step he took now had purpose. Every corridor he entered was chosen not because it was the shortest path, but because it was the safest one that avoided detection and interference. The palace around him still looked intact from the outside perspective. Lights still glowed in soft patterns. Walls still hummed with controlled energy. Automated systems still displayed calm indicators wherever he passed. But he no longer trusted any of it. The consistency he had known all his life inside the structure was breaking apart in ways only he seemed to fully notice. He moved through a maintenance corridor that most staff rarely used. It was narrow, lined with service panels and diagnostic ports that connected to the palace's deeper systems. Normally, these paths were used for repairs and inspections, not for movement during active hours. But tonight, the usual rules no longer mattered. As he walked, he kept checking the subtle signs around him. Faint delay in door response. A slight mismatch between visual indicators and system logs. Small details that most people would never connect together. To anyone else, it would still look like minor technical instability. But to him, it was becoming a map of something far more serious. The interference was not random. It was structured. That meant someone was inside the system with intent. He reached a junction where the corridor split into three directions. One path led toward lower service levels. One led toward administrative sectors. And one led directly upward toward the restricted residential wing. He stopped for only a second. There was no hesitation in his decision. He chose the upward path. As he climbed, the environment began to change slightly. The lighting became softer, more refined. The materials of the walls shifted from industrial panels to polished surfaces. This was the transition into higher security zones, where only authorized personnel were meant to pass. Normally, this area would have been heavily guarded. Patrol drones, motion scanners, identity locks at every intersection. But tonight, many of those systems were not behaving as expected. Some were delayed. Some were silent. Some responded too quickly, as if bypassed entirely. It was clear now that the intrusion was not just happening in one area. It was spreading. And worse, it was adapting. The human servant paused again near a side access panel. He placed his hand near it without touching, watching the faint indicators flicker. The response was delayed by a fraction of a second longer than normal. That delay told him something important. The system was no longer fully under palace control. External interference had reached this level too. He continued forward. In his mind, he began to build a mental picture of the palace layout, not as it was designed, but as it was currently functioning under interference. He mapped the likely points of failure, the corridors that would be most compromised, and the routes that would still remain partially stable. It was not something he had been trained to do officially, but observation had taught him more than instruction ever had. As he moved deeper into the upper levels, he started to notice something else. Absence. Guards were missing from posts where they should have been. Patrol routes that normally crossed at regular intervals were empty. Communication beacons that should have been active showed irregular blinking patterns or none at all. The palace was not just being attacked. It was being emptied of resistance. He quickened his pace. At one point, he passed a junction where a security drone was supposed to be stationed. Instead, the drone hovered in place, unmoving, as if stuck in a command loop. Its sensors were active, but it was not responding to environmental changes. It simply rotated slightly, scanning nothing in particular. He avoided it carefully, staying close to the wall until he passed. He did not trust anything automated anymore. As he reached a higher corridor, he began to hear faint sounds for the first time. Not alarms, not loud warnings, just distant echoes that did not belong in a controlled environment. A soft metallic shift somewhere ahead. A brief interruption in airflow. The faint hum of systems struggling to maintain stability. It was close now. He stopped near another access point and checked the panel. This one was more secure than the others. It required higher authorization. Under normal circumstances, he would not have been able to pass through. But the panel hesitated, scanned him. Then, after a longer pause than usual, it granted partial access. That should not have happened. He understood immediately that the system was no longer fully enforcing restrictions. Either it had been weakened, or it had been modified. The door opened slowly. On the other side was a narrow observation corridor overlooking part of the royal wing. From here, he could see further into the palace structure than before. What he saw confirmed what he had suspected. The upper wing was no longer fully secured. Movement was present where there should have been stillness. Shadows crossed between corridors in coordinated patterns. Doors that were meant to remain locked were now intermittently open. Security indicators flickered between states, no longer reliable. And deeper inside, near the central residential section, the system logs showed repeated disruptions. He studied the patterns carefully. They were converging toward one point, the royal children's chambers. His focus tightened. For the first time since the beginning of the night, the situation was no longer just about understanding what was happening. It was about timing. If he was wrong by even a few minutes, he might arrive too late. He left the observation corridor and moved faster. Now he was no longer trying to remain unnoticed. He was trying to beat the spread of the intrusion. As he advanced, he began to see signs of direct conflict that had already taken place. A corridor door marked with security clearance was damaged, not by force, but by precise override. A nearby access panel showed multiple failed attempts to restore control. On the floor, faint scorch marks indicated that a defensive system had activated briefly before being shut down. Someone had already reached this far. He turned another corner and stopped abruptly. Ahead, the corridor split again. But this time, one path showed clear signs of heavy interference. The lights flickered irregularly. The floor panels displayed inconsistent readings. The air felt slightly unstable, as if systems controlling atmosphere regulation were being overridden in real time. That path led directly toward the royal chambers. He did not need further confirmation. He moved into that direction. As he approached, he began to hear something more distinct. Not voices, but movement. Controlled, deliberate, organized movement. Multiple sources moving in coordination. It was no longer just infiltration. It was active occupation of the space. He slowed slightly, staying close to the edge of the corridor, using structural shadows for cover. He did not have weapons. He did not have armor. He did not have authority, but he had knowledge of the palace. And right now, that was the only advantage he had left. The corridor ahead opened into a wider junction leading toward the children's wing entrance. From here, everything became more sensitive. Any wrong step could trigger detection. Any delay could mean losing the chance to intervene at all. He stopped just before the junction. For a moment, everything was quiet again. But this was not the silence of safety. It was the silence before the moment everything would either collapse or be stopped. And he stepped forward anyway. He reached the entrance of the royal children's wing just as the palace itself seemed to hesitate. The corridor lights ahead of him flickered in uneven pulses, no longer following the calm, steady rhythm they were designed for. The soft glow that usually guided staff through the upper levels now felt unstable, like the palace was struggling to decide what it should show. Some sections of the hallway looked normal. Others flickered between dim safety lighting and sharp emergency tones that never fully activated. The human servant stopped just before stepping into full view. For a brief moment he stayed still, listening. Not to sounds alone, but to the behavior of the environment itself. The air circulation was uneven. A faint delay echoed through the floor sensors beneath his feet. Even the wall panels seemed slightly out of sync with each other, like parts of the system were no longer communicating properly. Something had already entered this place. And it was not just passing through. It was controlling parts of it. He pressed closer to the wall, moving slowly along the edge of the corridor where shadows were deepest. From here, he could see the entrance arch leading into the royal chamber access zone. This was the final barrier before the children's rooms. Normally, it would be sealed by multiple security layers, requiring full authorization from the palace command network. But now, the barrier was partially open. Not fully disabled. Not destroyed. Just rewritten. The door cycles were still functioning, but they were no longer consistent. Every few seconds, the system hesitated as if waiting for confirmation from a command it no longer trusted. That hesitation created small windows of access, and those windows were being used. He watched carefully. Then he saw movement. Not sudden. Not chaotic. Controlled. A shadow passed across the far end of the corridor beyond the entrance. Then another. Their motion was coordinated, not rushed, not panicked. Whoever had entered this space was not exploring. They were positioning. The human servant lowered his posture slightly, keeping his body close to structural cover. He had no weapon, no shield, nothing that could match what he assumed the intruders carried. But he had something else that mattered more in this moment. Awareness of how the palace was built. He knew where every blind spot was. He knew where every system delayed its response. And he knew how the palace behaved when it was not fully in control of itself. Another movement appeared ahead. This one was closer. A figure passed near a junction where light briefly flickered. The shape was indistinct, partially obscured by shifting illumination, but its movement was deliberate. It paused briefly at a wall panel, interacted with it, and continued forward without hesitation. That confirmed it. The palace systems were not just failing. They were being actively used. He tightened his focus. The children's chamber was just beyond that junction. If he waited any longer, the situation would shift from uncertain to irreversible. He began to move again. Slowly, carefully, every step placed with precision to avoid triggering motion sensors that might still be partially active. He avoided the center of the floor, staying near the edges where maintenance channels reduced detection sensitivity. His eyes constantly scanned for changes in lighting patterns, panel reflections, and subtle shifts in airflow that could indicate hidden surveillance. As he advanced, he noticed something troubling. The security network was still partially alive. But it was no longer unified. Some systems responded normally. Others responded with delay. A few responded incorrectly, as if they had been given false instructions. This meant that even if he triggered an alarm, there was no guarantee it would reach the right response units. The palace had become fragmented, and that fragmentation was being used against itself. He reached a narrow intersection just before the final chamber access hall. From here, the corridor widened slightly, leading directly to the entrance of the royal children's rooms. There were supposed to be multiple guards stationed here. There were none. Instead, there were signs of disruption. A dropped communication device on the floor. A flickering wall panel showing incomplete status logs. A security drone hovering near the ceiling, but not responding to movement in the area below it. The drone rotated slowly, scanning nothing in particular, as if its recognition systems had been partially blinded. The human servant watched it carefully, then moved beneath its blind angle, using structural beams for cover. He did not trust it. He did not trust anything anymore. As he approached the final corridor, the sound became more noticeable. Not loud, but structured. Footsteps, multiple sources, moving in patterns that were not random. They stopped, resumed, adjusted positions, and coordinated without verbal communication. Whoever was inside had already established control over this section of the palace. He paused again, just before the final turn. He could feel it now. The center of the intrusion was directly ahead. And beyond that, the children. He exhaled slowly, not in fear, but in focus. Then he moved. He stepped into the final corridor. The moment he did, the environment changed. The lighting here was more unstable than anywhere else he had passed. It flickered between normal illumination and emergency red tones that never fully stabilized. The walls showed signs of repeated system overrides. Even the floor panels beneath him felt less responsive, as if the structure itself was unsure of its own state. Ahead, the entrance to the royal children's chamber was visible. It was partially open, not forced, not broken, just unlocked through internal override. And in front of it, movement. Two figures stood near the entrance, positioned as if guarding or controlling access. Their stance was steady, alert, and precise. They were not distracted. They were watching the surrounding corridor for any approach. The human servant immediately stopped behind cover. He studied them without moving. They were not behaving like panic-driven intruders. They were disciplined. That meant they had training, coordination, and a clear objective. He shifted his attention to the chamber entrance itself. Inside, he could see faint movement, shadows shifting behind the doorway, the presence of multiple individuals already inside the room. The children were in there, and the system designed to protect them was no longer fully active. A soft mechanical sound echoed through the corridor as another door further back cycled without command. That meant the system was still unstable, still being manipulated in real time. He had very little time. He looked at the environment again. The ceiling structure, the wall panels, the emergency manual override ports that had been sealed but not reinforced. He mentally mapped every point of access, every weak spot in the immediate area. Then he noticed something important. One of the security systems had not been fully disabled. It was partially active. A dormant defense layer embedded in the corridor walls. It was designed to activate only in extreme breach conditions. The system was old, not integrated into the newer network fully, which meant it might not have been compromised yet. He slowly shifted closer to a side panel, avoiding detection. The system indicator flickered faintly. It was still alive. Barely. He studied it for a moment longer, then made a decision. If he could trigger it manually, even partially, it might disrupt the intruder's coordination long enough to create an opening. But it would also expose his position. He looked back toward the chamber entrance. The movement inside was increasing. Time was running out. He placed his hand near the panel, not activating it yet, just preparing. He waited one final moment, watching the corridor ahead, measuring timing, counting movement patterns. Then he pressed forward into action. He did not hesitate anymore. The human servant pressed his hand against the old side panel, feeling the faint vibration of a system that was still alive but barely holding together. The indicator light flickered weakly, like it was struggling to decide whether it should respond or shut down completely. For a moment, nothing happened. The corridor stayed silent, except for the distant, controlled movement near the royal chamber entrance. Then the system reacted. Not loudly, not with alarms or flashing warnings. Instead, it responded in a slow, reluctant way, as if it had been asleep for too long and was being forced to wake up. A low pulse moved through the wall panels. Hidden mechanisms that had not been used in years began to initialize. The air itself seemed to shift slightly, like the palace was remembering something it had almost forgotten. He stepped back immediately after triggering it. Now it was active. But activation alone was not enough. It needed time to build stability before it could do anything useful. And time was exactly what he did not have. He turned his attention back toward the corridor ahead. The two figures near the chamber entrance had noticed the change. Their posture shifted slightly. They were no longer focused only on the doorway. Their attention spread across the corridor, searching for the source of the disturbance. The human servant stayed still, pressed into the shadow of the wall. He kept his breathing controlled. Every instinct told him to move, but moving too early would mean being seen before the system fully engaged. Inside the chamber, movement increased. He could not see clearly, but he could hear enough to understand that the situation inside was active. Not chaotic, but controlled. That was worse. Controlled movement meant the children were not yet out of time, but they were also not safe. The wall panel beside him emitted a faint hum as the dormant system continued to wake up. He knew it would not stay silent much longer. When it reached full activation, it would disrupt everything in this section of the palace. Lights, sensors, doors, and possibly communication lines would all be affected. It was a risk, but it was the only chance. One of the figures near the entrance moved slightly forward, stepping into the corridor. The second stayed near the doorway, maintaining position. They were splitting coverage, trying to prevent anyone from approaching unnoticed. The human servant adjusted his position by a few inches, careful not to make any sound. The corridor was tight here with limited cover. One wrong movement would expose him completely. Then the system reached its next stage. A deep pulse traveled through the structure. The lighting in the corridor flickered violently for a second before stabilizing into a harsher tone. Not normal illumination anymore. Emergency response mode. Old defensive protocols activating after long inactivity. The intruders reacted immediately. Their attention shifted toward the walls and ceiling. They were no longer fully focused on the chamber. They were assessing the sudden environmental change. That moment of distraction was exactly what he had been waiting for. He moved, fast, not running blindly, but moving with controlled urgency. He crossed the first segment of the corridor in a low position, staying close to structural edges where detection was weakest. The sound of the system activating masked his movement slightly, but not completely. The figure nearest to the corridor entrance turned sharply. They had seen him. A brief moment of stillness followed. Then everything escalated at once. The human servant reached another wall section and triggered a second hidden control point he had noticed earlier. It was not part of his assigned knowledge, but he had studied enough of the palace structure over time to understand how some older systems could be chained together in emergencies. This second activation sent another pulse through the corridor. Now the system fully awakened. The palace reacted. Wall panels shifted. Hidden locks engaged and disengaged in rapid cycles. The lighting broke into fragmented patterns, no longer stable enough to support coordinated visual tracking. Even the floor beneath shifted slightly as pressure sensors recalibrated. It was not perfect, but it was enough to disrupt coordination. The intruders were forced to adjust quickly. Their formation broke slightly as they attempted to regain control of their surroundings. Communication between them became less efficient as the palace systems interfered with signal clarity. The human servant used that moment. He advanced again, closing distance toward the chamber entrance. Now he was closer, close enough to see more clearly. Inside the royal chamber, he could finally make out the presence of movement. The children were there, positioned deeper inside the room. They were not alone, but they were also not fully restrained. The situation inside was tense, unstable, but not yet fully resolved. That meant there was still time, but not much. One of the intruders stepped into his path. This time, there was no avoidance possible. The corridor was too narrow. The moment both of them locked eyes, the tension shifted instantly. The intruder moved first, raising an arm to block the passage. The human servant did not try to match force with force. Instead, he reacted by stepping sideways into a blind angle created by the flickering lights. The environment itself became his advantage. The emergency system continued to pulse through the structure, causing unpredictable lighting and sensor interference. That interference made precise tracking difficult. He used that. He moved past the first obstruction before the intruder could fully adjust. But the second intruder reacted faster. A sharp movement cut across the corridor, forcing him to stop again. The distance between him and the chamber entrance was now extremely small, but access was blocked. He had no weapon, no formal defense tools, only timing and knowledge of the system he had just activated. Inside the chamber, something shifted. A deeper movement, a change in pattern. It was not visible from his position, but he could feel it in the way the surrounding systems responded. The palace itself was reacting more aggressively now, as if recognizing that a critical threshold had been crossed. He understood what that meant. The system was entering full defensive lock response. That would either isolate the chamber completely or trigger full shutdown of surrounding systems. Either outcome would create chaos. He used that window. As the lighting flickered again, he slipped past the second intruder using a narrow gap between sensor coverage cycles. The movement was precise, almost timed with the pulses of the system itself. For a brief moment, he was at the chamber entrance. He saw inside clearly now. The royal children were there, positioned toward the far side of the room. The space around them was partially controlled by intruders, but not fully secured. The situation was unstable. The balance had not yet been completely broken. And that meant there was still something he could do. The system pulse reached its peak. The corridor behind him erupted into full defensive confusion. Doors locked and unlocked unpredictably. Lights shifted into rapid cycles. Communication lines fractured completely. The intruders were forced to split attention between controlling the environment and maintaining their position. That was the opening. He stepped forward into the chamber. Not as a soldier, not as a guard, but as someone who had arrived exactly at the moment where delay meant failure. The room shifted instantly as he entered. Attention turned toward him. And for the first time since the beginning of the breach, the intruders lost control of the situation they had carefully built.